In every culture, ghost stories whisper truths that history prefers to forget. The Ghost-Brahmin, collected by Lal Behari De in colonial Bengal, is one such tale, a story where the supernatural becomes a mirror for the social. In this presentation, we'll trace the story's journey from rural Bengal's oral traditions to its larger historical and cultural context and explore how De's work bridges folklore, reform, and colonial modernity. The Ghost Brahmin is a story from the folk tales of Bengal, an early English documentation of rural Bengali folklore by Lal Behari De. The author, Lal Behari De, was born in 1824 in Sonapalsi, in the Bardharman district of Bengal, into a Suvarna Bainik family. His father was a small bill broker in Calcutta. After early schooling, he entered Alexander Duff's General Assembly Institution in Calcutta, where he absorbed both Western education and missionary Christian thought. In 1843, at age 19, he converted to Christianity. Over the years, he became a professor of English, a journalist, a missionary, and above all, a pioneer folklorist. His folktales of Bengal brought rural Bengali narratives into written English form. He also championed vernacular education and critiqued the zamindari and caste hierarchies of his time. His multiple roles, educator, reformer, collector of stories, position him uniquely for our exploration of the Ghost Brahmin. The story begins in rural Bengal. A poor non-Kulan Brahmin longed for respect through marriage. After begging from door to door, he finally gathered enough to wed, only to leave soon after in search of livelihood. That very evening, a ghost appeared, a perfect double. He took the Brahmin's place with such conviction that even the mother and wife failed to notice the deceit. When the real man returned years later, he found a stranger living his life, his home, his wife, and his very identity stolen by a phantom. Desperate, the Brahmin appeals to the king, but the ruler cannot distinguish truth from illusion. Justice is delayed, and the Brahmin is repeatedly told to return the next day. A group of cowherd boys playing at kingship noticed his daily despair. The young cowherd king summoned him, heard his tale, and with childlike cleverness proposed a trial the next day. Whoever could enter a tiny phial would be declared the true owner. The real Brahmin laughed. The ghost, proud and foolish, shrank and slipped inside. The boy sealed the bottle and ordered it thrown into the sea. At last, justice, not royal but rural, playful, and wise, restored the Brahmin's life. The Ghost Brahmin emerges from late 19th century Bengal, a period shaped by colonial modernity and the Bengal Renaissance. British administrators and missionaries were actively documenting Indian customs, while Indian intellectuals like Lal Behari De sought to reclaim these traditions in their own voice. The story unfolds in a rural pre industrial Bengal of the 19th century, a world where supernatural belief sits alongside daily labor and where oral traditions still govern meaning. The village in the tale is unnamed, timeless. It becomes an archetype rather than a specific locale. This is a tale of survival and identity crisis, deeply rooted in the Indian context. The horror doesn't emerge from dark corridors or decaying architecture, but from the collapse of social and moral order within a familiar village setting. Here, the uncanny is not foreign, it's woven into local folklore, superstition, and the porous boundaries between life and afterlife. During the early 19th century, the Gothic as a literary form had not yet been formalized in the Indian or Bengali context. Unlike Europe, where the Gothic had already developed recognizable structures like the haunted castle, the persecuted heroine, the narrative of transgression, Bengal's engagement with the Gothic was intuitive rather than formulaic. In the Ghost Brahmin, we see a vernacular Gothic emerging organically from folklore rather than from literary tradition. The haunting, the double, and the collapse of identity arise not from aesthetic convention but from lived anxieties of caste, displacement, and moral instability. This makes the tale a culturally distinct articulation of the Gothic, rooted in social experience rather than genre codification. This story exemplifies several key Gothic characteristics adapted to the Indian cultural milieu. In the Ghost-Brahmin, the supernatural intrusion of the ghost who assumes the Brahmin's form introduces the quintessential Gothic trope of haunting, a spectral double that destabilizes the boundaries between presence and absence, the real and the illusory. The motif of the double or doppelganger emerges as a central Gothic concern. Literally meaning double in German, the term signifies an uncanny replication of the self, a figure that exposes the fractures within identity. The Brahmin's encounter with his spectral counterpart dramatizes the Gothic anxiety of selfhood, the fear that one's social and personal reality can be occupied, even erased, by an imitation. This moment of doubling also stages the Gothic fear of erasure, that identity, morality, and truth are fragile performances that can be replicated. The Brahmin's displacement reveals how social recognition, not inner essence, defines existence. The ghost, in this sense, becomes the more real figure because he fits the roles society expects to see. In the Ghost Brahmin, dispossession becomes the central Gothic anxiety. The Brahmin's loss of his home, wife, and social standing echoes the Gothic's recurring preoccupation with inheritance, exile, and the instability of belonging. Equally potent is the psychological dimension. The Brahmin's disorientation and anguish upon discovering his displacement generate an atmosphere of internalized horror, a mode of Gothic effect rooted not in physical terror but in ontological uncertainty and existential loss. The narrative also interrogates systems of law, power, and morality, a key Gothic preoccupation. The king's inability to deliver justice when confronted with the ghostly double exposes the limitations of rational institutional authority. The legal system fails in the face of the supernatural because the law is built upon visibility, reason, and evidence, things the spectral inherently resists. The king's failure to administer justice underscores the Gothic's skepticism towards institutional authority, while the mock trial of the cowherd king subverts normative hierarchies, producing a moment of uncanny justice that privileges play, intuition, and subversion over law and order. This story operates as a cultural Gothic hybrid, a space where Indian folklore and colonial Gothic sensibilities intersect. On one hand, it draws deeply from indigenous contexts, the caste system, folk belief, and the supernatural that naturally inhabits everyday life. On the other, its English diction and narrative style reveal a consciousness of a colonial readership. The phrase, like neatherd, echo Victorian idioms, subtly translating the local into a form palatable to the British imagination. In this hybridity, the tale performs a double gesture. It speaks from within Indian cosmology while negotiating the colonial gaze. The ghost then becomes a shared Gothic language, both a local spirit of haunting and a colonial metaphor for fractured identity and displacement. Through this blend, Tay's narrative embodies a post colonial Gothic, one that reclaims the uncanny as a site of cultural negotiation rather than mere imitation. When we examine the Ghost Brahmin, what becomes striking is how its social preoccupations, caste, class, marriage, and identity, are infused with a distinctly Gothic sensibility. Marriage here is not a bond of love, but a transaction shaped by caste and class, where legitimacy is bought and the woman becomes an emblem of possession, not agency. The Kulin system reinforces this hierarchy through hypergamy, turning marriage into a mechanism of control rather than choice. It echoes the Gothic conviction that marriage is never merely a union of love, but a site of possession, power, and the terrifying loss of selfhood within the social order. Family, too, is defined not by affection, but by the performance of roles husband, son, provider. The ghost's easy substitution shows how identity in the society depends on conformity, not intimacy. Class, meanwhile, becomes the site of inversion, a classic Gothic trope. The collapse of royal and judicial authority and the rise of justice from the margins mirror the Gothic's fascination with social decay and the grotesque overturning of order. The folk trial enacts a carnivalesque justice, where power is mocked and truth seeps through disorder. Desire, meanwhile, becomes spectral, a yearning not just for love, but for legitimacy and belonging, echoing the Gothic's eternal hunger for recognition from a world that withholds it. And finally, caste runs through it all, both as a structure of power and as an illusion. The story is set against the rigid hierarchy of the Indian caste system, divided into Brahmins, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, Shudras, and Dalits. Even within the Brahmin order, there existed an internal hierarchy, the Kulina, Kshotriya, and Kasta Kulan ranks. The Kulina, or noble Brahmins, claimed the purest lineage, and this obsession with ritual and ancestral purity shaped ideas of marriage, inheritance, and social legitimacy. In this tale, caste becomes the localized Gothic, a system of inherited purity and exclusion that produces its own ghosts of displacement and social haunting. To unpack these layers, let's pause and clarify a few key terms that anchor the story's social dynamics. A Brahmin is a member of the priestly caste, historically tasked with ritual and teaching. Kulin refers to elite Bengali Brahmins who maintain their status through regulated marriage and lineage. Kotwal means a police officer, and Vizier refers to an advisor or minister. Here, cowherd boys, quite unlike the gunslinging cowboys of the American West, are simply village lads tending their cattle in the fields of rural Bengal. Lal Behari De's Folk Tales of Bengal, published in 1875 and later reissued in 1883, remains one of the earliest English compilations of Bengali oral tradition. The story of the Ghost-Brahman was later reimagined in modern culture, most notably in the 2005 Bollywood film Behari, available on Netflix. Yet beyond these interpretations, the narrative opens up new possibilities for inquiry, inviting a closer examination of its silences, inversions, and the unresolved tensions that shape its Gothic imagination. The narrative privileges the Brahmin's psychological turmoil while effacing the wife's and mother's agony, revealing a gendered hierarchy of suffering. While the ghost's deception devastates the family, the story centers the Brahmin's distress with no dialogues given to the women who were equally violated, marginalizing the emotional and psychological trauma of the women. The absence of their voices signals the erasure of feminine interiority within patriarchal and religious discourse. The narrative exposes the moral inadequacy of institutional authority as the court's judgment fails to restore justice. The ghost in a bottle motif connects this Bengali folktale to broader mythic traditions, reminiscent of the genie trapped in a lamp or bottle. This is not just a colonial Gothic tale set in India, it's an Indian Gothic, one that grafts local fears and cosmologies into the Gothic frame. The hybridity becomes the story's very texture, part folklore, part colonial artifact, entirely spectral.